Hi guys. In my last video I showed this old 410 3-inch Lee loader, and apparently there's some interest in seeing some shells loaded with this, so I thought I'd put this video together to show you that process. There are some other things you're going to need, of course, other than what comes in the box. You will of course need a supply of lead shot. You will need appropriate smokeless powder. In this case I have Winchester 296. You will need some primers. You will also need, of course, some 410 wads. And even more important than all that is a source of load data. Now, normally I would recommend using the most modern data available. In this case we're going to go with some slightly older data, because modern reloading books do not generally have much in the way of 3/4 ounce loads for the 410. And this Lee loader has a 3/4 ounce shot dipper. So we're going to go back into the past to get our load data. And I'm not going to bother telling you what my load data is. You can go look up data on your own compared to which would be appropriate for whatever components that you have to work with. So anyway, so we've got our supplies, and we need some extra tools. We need a funnel, a fairly small funnel that will fit at least reasonably close to the end of a 410 shell. That's an important piece of kit. We also need a rubber or plastic or wood mallet, which we're going to need to reprime the shells. It's also very handy to have a cartridge reloading block, such as you would use for loading rifle or pistol rounds, to keep the shells from falling over once they've been charged with powder. So that's a real handy thing to have. Something else you'll need if you're going to do roll crimps are some overshot cards. These are just some ones I punched out of an old box using a wad punch. Those are not necessary if you're going to do a standard fold or pie type crimp. And we'll also need a container to put our powder in while we scoop it out with the measure. Because I'm varying this this load from what's in the instructions in the book here, I'm using a different powder scoop than came in the loader. This is a smaller scoop than the one that's in the loader. And a couple of thoughts on the data that comes with this particular old loader. You'll notice here that it's got 3/4 of an ounce of shot and 15.2 grains of Hercules 2400. You'll notice that there are no recommendations here as to the type of wad to use, the type of primer to use, and the type of hull to use. Now, I'm going to make some assumptions here because of the age of this loader. This came from back in the day when most of the hulls that people had were paper hulls, much like this Imperial 3-inch paper hull. And most people were loading them in the 60s anyway with paper or fiber wads. Now, the loading data for a paper case and for fiber wads is going to be quite a bit different than it would be with a modern style plastic case and a modern style plastic wad. So if you are using modern components, I suggest you use modern data to go with those components. Otherwise you're going to get a lot of potential for problems with excessive pressure and so forth. So with that warning out of the way, we'll move on to loading some shells. So first thing we have to do is we need to deprime our fired 410 shells. Now to do that, we basically take the body of the tool here, we remove the plunger, and set that out of the way. And you notice in the top there's a bit of a depressed area here, and that will accommodate the head of the 410 shell like that. We've also got a decapping rod here, and there's the decapping pin portion of it. That goes inside the hull in that fashion. Set the whole business in top of the die body there, and give it a bit of a tap with our plastic mallet, and that will pop the fired primer out. You can take that out and set it back in the box. And our fired primer has been knocked out the bottom. We can throw that away, of course, it's garbage. The next step is to reprime, and of course when you're priming or handling powder or any of those sorts of things, you should wear some safety glasses, especially using the system that Lee uses, where you're basically tapping the primer into place. It's a good idea to wear some safety glasses. So now, a couple of ways you can do this. We of course need to use our recapping rod, and it is a hollow at one end, and that hollow end fits down inside the shell from the top like that, and it goes over. You just basically put the shell over the top of the primer. Now if you got a good hard surface, you can do this on a good hard flat surface. As long as it's smooth and clean, you can tap the primer into place on a hard surface like that. I've got a piece of Arborite here for a countertop. That's quite acceptable. What Lee shows in the directions is putting the ram in and setting the primer on top of the ram, because that of course gives you a good firm hard surface, and then setting the shell with the priming ram on that over the top and tapping it in place. And the emphasis here is of course on having a flat, clean surface. If you had a pellet of shot down there or some dirt, you could potentially discharge the primer when you're seating it. So, but we got a good clean surface here, so that's not a problem. So we're going to tap, use the other end here, going to tap that primer down. And this is one of those things you should develop a bit of a feel for after you've done it a while. And our primer's been seated there. So, alright, after we've got all our hulls primed, we can put some suitable powder into a container. I like to use this old yogurt container, it's about the right size. And with our shells in the loading block, I like to keep all the shells that I have not charged with powder turned upside down until I charge them with powder. That's kind of a safety precaution. So I'll flip a shell over and put the funnel in it. And with the funnel in place, I'll dip a charge out of the powder. And I like to dip the powder charge, or the powder scoop, down below the powder. Give it a sideways shake. Oops, that wasn't working out so good there. Dip it down below. Give it a sideways shake to level it off, and then dump it in. Okay, we've charged these hulls with powder. Now it's time to seat a wad. Now I'm going to give you a little demonstration here how things have changed since the days of these old cardboard paper tubed hulls. With an old hull like this and a wad, it's pretty easy to actually start these without doing anything other than giving the wad a little bit of a twist. And you can, as you can see, it starts quite easily because the end of the hull stays quite opened up after it's fired. With a newer style shell, these were a roll crimped paper hull, you can see that the hull begins to, it retains some of its memory and it curls back in, so as you can see it's kind of a bit of a challenge to get these started. It can be done, but it's a bit of a fussy thing. And to help with that little task, we included this little tool, and that basically is just there to flare open the hull a bit. So essentially that will expand the mouth of the hull enough to let us easily start the wad down in there. Later editions of this style of tool came with a finger type plastic wad guide, which helps with this kind of problem. It actually fits right over the entire shell, and it's a good solution too, but this is a little older setup, so it has this style. And we're going to get the die body out of the box again. And the die body can be used to finish seating the wad all the way to the bottom. You can put the whole die body and the rammer together, fit it over the top of the shell. And that finished seating the wad down hard against the powder. So we've got our wad seated good and firm down against the powder. Okay, we've got the wads firmly seated in all the hulls, so the next step is to charge them with shot. we've got our 3/4 ounce dipper here and our supply of lead shot. Same process as using the dipper for powder. Just fill it up, give it a shake. You don't want a bunch of pellets piled up on top of it. It's basically meant to be used level. And using our funnel once again, we'll just add our shot. Okay, now that we've got the shot in the hulls, we need to put an overshot card on these because I'm going to roll crimp these. The original crimp on this shell was a roll crimp, so I'm going to replicate that with these top cards, which I have punched out of some cardstock. So we'll just drop a card on top of each of these, and then we're going to press it in place lightly using the ram out of the die body. And where did that go? There it is right there. So basically you just want to have that sitting flat on top of the shot. Okay, next comes the tricky bit. These Lee loaders are capable of forming a roll crimp, and it develops a pretty good roll crimp if you get your technique right, and you have to get a bit of a feel for it, so you'll probably mess up a few shells while you learn what you're doing. Essentially what it amounts to, though, this die body will roll the crimp in as you force it down over the shell, and once you've started to curl the crimp in, this ram is then used to catch the edge of that shell and turn it over and push it down upon itself. So this is done incrementally. It's not something you can do in one step, you have to do it in stages. So to start with, you put the die body over the loaded hull, and then you push down to start curling the crimp in. Now what I find works best is to actually use something to push down against this this body. I usually just grab a hold of the rammer and use the top of the use the side of the rammer to push the body down. Now you can look down inside the hull or inside the tool, and you can see while you're working at it, you can see this happening. You can see it starting to curl the top of the crimp in there. And what this is going to do is provide a surface for the ram to grab. So once you've seen that starting to form, you then take your ram and catch the edge of that and curl it over. Now I'll take the shell out here to show you what started. You can see where we went from a taper to an actual curled over. You can see the crimp starting to form there. It looks like hell right at the moment, but it'll look better as we move it along. Now I've noticed that with this die body, the spacer that they give you for the Remington shells is almost a necessity with any shell if you're going to put a roll crimp on it. So you pretty much have to use that spacer underneath the shell. Put the die body over the top of it again. Sorry. Progress the crimp down a bit more. And I'll take the shell out again to show you how this is starting to form. You can see it's looking a little better. So we'll just continue that process. And as I said, this is one of these things that requires a bit of practice and finesse. As you can tell, it's not a real high-speed operation. And we're getting a pretty good crimp there. You can see how that's turning over fairly nicely. It's still not tight though, you can hear the shot rattling around, so we need to move that down further. That top card should be pinched securely so that we get a good start pressure on the shell. Good crimps lead to consistent ignition. That's probably about as good as we're going to get. So you can see we've got a reasonably well formed roll crimp. all without using one of those drill press type roll crimpers. So that's one thing you can do with this tool that is hard to do with most other loaders. I'll load another shell here using a fold crimp and show you that one. Alright, the last item we're going to cover is forming a standard fold or pie crimp using this tool. Starts off the same way it did with the roll crimp. We put the die body over the top of the shell, and then we'll force the die body down. And I'll push the shell out here so you can see what's happening. As you can see, it's starting to form the crimp over. Now, generally speaking, these plastic shells will follow the original form of the crimp. The later tools came with a crimp starting tool, but basically most of the time a plastic shell will follow the original crimp and you'll get an acceptable crimp without that crimp starter. So we'll continue to form the crimp, and actually I'm going to use this spacer once again under the shell so that I can force the shell into the die even more. If we were to look down inside the shell, or inside the die body, I'll take the shell out here to show you, you can see that we've formed the crimp closed even more. So I'll put the shell back in, and with the crimp closed over pretty far, we'll then put the ram in and push the crimp down. And you can see, having done that, we've formed, get the camera to focus there, we've formed what would be a reasonable crimp. Not a great crimp, but it's a reasonable one. We can continue to form that crimp down further if we want a tighter crimp. Once again, using the spacer, I find that you need the spacer for practically all of these. And we can form a bit more of a radius on it by forcing the shell in, get a little bit of a radius on it. And if we want to poke the center portion of the crimp down a little further, once again we can push the ram down a little harder. And there we go. We've got that's formed a pretty decent crimp. So anyway, this video has gotten a little bit on the long side, but we've covered all the basics, so hopefully that answers the need for a video showing this tool at work. So thanks for watching, guys, and we'll talk to you in the next video, whatever that happens to be.